Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online conference, Transitional Justice, a Time for a Material Turn, ? My name is Liora Bielski, and I am a law professor in Tel Aviv Law Faculty and the director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights in Tel Aviv University. It is my great pleasure to open our third annual Transitional Justice International Conference, which the two centers of Minerva Human Rights in Tel Aviv University and in the Hebrew University organized together. Each year, one of the centers take the lead in organizing the conference, and this year it was the pleasure of the Tel Aviv Center. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge and thank the driving force and mind behind this year's conference, Advocate Tamar Luster, who is a PhD candidate in Meitar Center here in Tel Aviv University, and who will also present a paper in the first panel. So thank you very much, Tamar. Another novelty of this year is the decision to hold a local workshop for Israeli participants next week, in which we will meet in person and discuss in depth the challenges of transitional justice in Israel. I want to thank the organizing committee, Dani Evron, Einat Albin, Kineret Sadeh, Yuli Litov, and the secretaries of both centers, Ayelet and Anat, for all their help in creating this wonderful conference. This year's theme, Material Aspects of Transitional Justice, is especially timely after 2 years of COVID, which underlined the centrality of the body, disease, global and local inequality, climate change, and scarcity. We wanted this year's conference to address the field of transitional justice through material lenses and see how it changes our understanding of the field, its potential and limitations. In the next 2 days, we will discuss the role of economic actors such as business corporations, social and economic rights, temporal and spatial aspects of transitional processes. We will turn our attention from criminal tribunals to civil litigation, examine the role of settlement, the changing phases of reparation, and the material aspects of memory and commemorative remedies. We deliberately put a question mark in our title, A Time for Material Turn. Indeed, several of the papers we discuss are very critical of the field of transitional justice basic assumptions, doctrines, and toolkit. Some even claim that the material lens exposes a continued failure and transitional injustice. The material focus helps us therefore question the basic structures and limitations of the field and to identify the possibility of a fourth wave of transitional justice, attempting to design transformative mechanisms that will be better suited to address root causes and long processes. My own research in the field of Holocaust and the law has been focused on material aspects for more than a decade now. Anticipating the end of the era of the witness, a material turn has occupied the interest of Holocaust studies. My own book, The Holocaust, Corporations and the Law, identifies the rise of a new paradigm of transnational litigation against corporations in American civil courts, and the way it reshaped the institution of settlement and brought about the creation of historical corporate commissions. My current research also deals with issues of cultural restitution and examines the interesting connections between the struggles to restitute Nazi-looted artworks and contemporary struggles to decolonize European museums. Our conference touches on many of the dilemmas that have occupied Holocaust research for some time now, and I'm looking forward to the discussion of how these issues are changing the boundaries of the field of transitional justice. I wish us all a good conference and fruitful discussion. And now I turn to Einat Albin from Minerva, Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liora, and thank you all for being here. Thanks to all participants and to those who joined us for this wonderful two-day program, which I see as intriguing, and I welcome you all here. It's interesting that both the Minerva Center at Hebrew University for Human Rights and both the Tel Aviv Center focus on issues on transitional justice even before this joint program was established. The Minerva Center at the Hebrew University is already engaged with the topic of transitional justice for 12 years. We have study tours, taking students to areas of conflict, learning on issues on transitional justice. We have a special LLM program on transitional justice. This year, we had the first course on transitional justice in Hebrew for our LLB students within the Faculty of Law. And we organized events throughout the year. And I was thinking, how is it that both leading centers of human rights in Israel are very much engaged with the issue of transitional justice? I'm sure it's also very much related to topics and areas of interest and research. Liora is a leading researcher in the field, as you just heard, and also people that work in our center have been very much engaged with research, but it's also related, I think, to the place where we are working. And we can't, given the Israel-Palestine conflict, distinguish ourselves from this issue, which is central and very, very important. So I want to thank the cooperation between the two centers around this issue of transitional justice. For me, it's a particular pleasure to work with Liora, who was my teacher and my mentor during my second degree. And I'm very appreciative of the cooperation, Liora, the work we're doing together. I think it's very important. And for me, it's fulfilling academically and personally. Also, the focus on the material. As a person who comes from labor law, social rights, economic rights, it's a crucial topic for transitional justice. And just by reviewing the papers that are going to be presented during these 2 days, I see how much it is an issue, and it is an issue that we have to address thoroughly, and that there are various different perspectives here. And I'm very happy that you posed this as a topic for this year's conference. Of course, I want to join your thanks to all those who were involved in organizing this conference, to the people from the Minerva Center at the Hebrew University, Darinov, Dani Evron, of course, and Anat Mishali, and our postdoc on areas of transitional justice, Arin Hawari, and also the staff from Tel Aviv University, particularly Liora, Kineret, and of course Tamar, Yuli, and Yael. Thank you so much for the hard work that has been done in organizing this. And I am wishing us all fruitful 2 days of interesting and intriguing conversations. Thank you. So hello again. I'm Einat Alben. I'm from the Minerva Center of Human Rights at the Hebrew University, and I have the privilege to chair this next session. First of all, something that I did not mention in my opening remarks is that this entire cooperation between the Minerva Center at Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew University on issues of transitional justice is supported by the Max Planck Institute, and we are very grateful for their support. This enabled us to have this yearly conference, annual conference with the two centers, and also to have 2 postdoctorate positions, one at Tel Aviv University and one at the Hebrew University on issues of transitional justice. So we are very grateful for their support. This session is on social and economic rights, markets, and transitional justice. And in this session, we are going to have 3 fabulous papers presented. I will ask each of the presenters to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, so we'll have enough time for discussion afterwards. And I want to present the first group of scholars who will present their paper. Professor Finula Nioai Onlen, who is concurrently Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota Law School and Professor of Law at the Queen's University in Belfast. She is the recipient of numerous academic awards, including the Leverhulme Fellowship, the Fulbright Scholarship, ASIL Certificate of Merit for Creative Scholarship, the Alon Prize, the Robert Schuman Scholarship, and Lawler Fellowship. She has published extensively on issues of gender, conflict regulation, transitional justice, and counterterrorism. She has held academic positions at Columbia Law School, at Harvard, Princeton, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Ni-Ai Olen is currently the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism. And we are very lucky to have that you have time to join us in our conference today and in this session. Together, she wrote a paper with Professor Rory O'Connell, a professor of human rights and constitutional law and research director at Ulster University, Northern Ireland. From 2014 to 2020, Professor O'Connell was the director of the Transitional Justice Institute. He is a member of the Transformation and Empowerment Stream and sits on the executive of the Committee on the Administration of Justice. His latest book is Law, Democracy, and the European Court of Human Rights, published by Cambridge in 2020. And he was a member of the ESRC-funded Brexit Law Project on the constitutional, legal, and human rights implication of Brexit for Northern Ireland. The third contributor to this paper is Dr. Lina Malajan. I hope I pronounced it right. She's a research associate at the University of Ulster's Transitional Justice Institute. Her career has balanced academic research with work as a researcher, litigant, and an advocate in conflicted justice and peace building in Colombia and other countries. Lina works in the project on socioeconomic rights and transitions at the GCRF Hub, developing research on the case studies of Northern Ireland and Colombia. The research engages with diverse stakeholders with experience in using peace agreements and transitional justice measures to leverage further socioeconomic claims. They will present before us their paper, Supporting and Transformative Peace in Northern Ireland, the Material Dimensions of Peace Agreements as Social and Economic Rights. Thank you. The floor is yours.
I think Rory is going to start us, but it looks like he may not be able to join us. Rory, are you on?
I saw Rory already.
Yeah.
He's on.
We have division of labor here, but so maybe what Rory is trying to get on, I'll just say, oh, Rory, you got it. Great.
Are you okay?
Apologies. I just had to deal with the delights of having a dog while working from home.
So I'm counting the 15 minutes from now.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So thank you very much. And I think Fionnuala may have explained that Fionnuala and I will do the presentation. Though Lena may well want to join in the questions and answers or add anything that we've left out later. So our paper reflects on the transformative potential of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement in 1998. Next year will be the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. And no doubt will be an occasion for the great and the good to congregate once again in Belfast and Northern Ireland and congratulate themselves on a done deal. But whilst there's much to celebrate about the agreement, for those of us who are familiar with this place in Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland, there still seems to be much unfulfilled about the promise of the Good Friday Agreement. So in our paper, we talk about the promise of the agreement, the way in which, if you will, power reasserts itself and may stymie some of the more transformative potential and promise of that agreement, and the idea of a counterpower, the idea of solidarity in civil society as one resource for vindicating the transformative potential of the agreement. In terms of the promise of the Good Friday Agreement and the way we analyze it, we draw on Clara Sandoval's typology of different types of societal change, so ordinary social change, structural change, and more fundamental change, which doesn't just affect structures, but also affects ideologies, and which is a much longer term project. The Good Friday Agreement, despite our cautionary tale, does of course have much to celebrate. It has brought about an end to large-scale organized political violence. It has transformed the domestic political structures in Northern Ireland. It does include some genuinely imaginative provisions, such as the possibility of a referendum on Irish unification and cross-border institutions, both north, south, and east, west. But as well as those provisions, which have by and large been implemented, we also have other elements of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, which speak to other aspects of socioeconomic transformation. We have elements of the agreement, for instance, that talk about a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, a Bill of Rights that could perhaps include socioeconomic rights that haven't really received much constitutional protection in Northern Ireland or the UK or Ireland. More transformative potential in terms of addressing matters of economic and social justice, promises about greater equality measures, the promise to introduce what at the time was a very innovative equality mainstreaming duty into Northern Ireland, promises about guaranteeing women's participation in public life, and a commitment to certain types of economic and social reform through different economic, different social protection measures that were in vogue at the time under the then new Labour government. And also a greater commitment to participation as a value. The Good Friday Belfast Agreement, for instance, promised a civic forum in which the different strands of Northern Ireland civic society could offer commentary and advice to government, the executive, and the assembly on different reforms. In terms of the delivery on those promises, though, the record is very mixed. Some have been delivered, but especially in relation to more economic and social aspects, the more socioeconomic rights aspects, power has, in a sense, reasserted itself. And in our paper, we try to understand how it is that some of these promises or apparent promises don't get delivered, and what potential is there still to realize them. So we talk about half a dozen different mechanisms or challenges that have prevented the realization of the more transformative potential of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. Some of these go back to the very wording of the agreement of itself. So in the agreement, we do have certain implicit or sometimes not so implicit hierarchies between different types of rights. And we do have imprecision or ambiguities in how certain rights are framed. So for instance, we have language about the importance of civil and political rights, but the economic and social rights aspects of the agreement quickly get downplayed to being economic and social interests rather than being on the same level as civil and political rights. We have imprecision and ambiguity in terms of some of the commitments about the more transformative potential. So for instance, in relation to a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, what we have is more a guarantee of consultation rather than the promise of a strong Bill of Rights. We have concerns about how different parts of the agreement are not so readily enforceable, whether in domestic or in international fora. And this has become, I suppose, a particular issue as the United Kingdom's attitude towards international law in the context of Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol becomes increasingly problematic. We have a concern about the degree to which the agreement and different reforms on it emphasize matters of procedure rather than substance. And this has been a particular problem in relation to the equality mainstreaming duty in Northern Ireland, what we call Section 75, equality mainstreaming duty, which should have been a vehicle to put equality of opportunity at the heart of public policy making and service delivery, but has instead, for many people, become something of a tick box exercise over the past 25 years. One where the technicalities of the process often are beyond the capacity of civil society organizations to properly address. And then we have even more fundamental problems with the agreement in terms of the balance in the agreement, in terms of the way in which the power sharing dimension of the agreement has functioned. So while undoubtedly the introduction of democratic power sharing government has been a major change, a transformative, even perhaps fundamental change in the workings of the Northern Ireland polity, it has also resulted in a system of cross-community voting, which effectively includes a community veto, with the risk that policy is about trying to keep both sides in what is a diverse community, but to keep the two main traditions happy, but without necessarily being able to deliver on more progressive and radical change. And that may in particular impact on issues relating to gender rights and women's participation, for instance. So the mutual veto system in a power sharing system may empower a conservative political party to block progressive change, but also may create incentives for other political parties to avoid hard issues. And with the resulting tendency that, to be blunt about it, you may have the risk of a sectarian carve-up in terms of policy delivery rather than progressive change based on objective criteria. And the final point to which we draw attention in our concerns is the failure to reform some key formal and informal power structures. So the 1998 agreement certainly reformed the domestic political institutions. It was accompanied with fairly radical changes to the policing system and changes to some of the other political systems. But for instance, one part of the power structure that simply wasn't discussed, was taken really for granted, was the role of the civil service and whether or not there was any need to reform the civil service to ensure the sort of more radical and transformative potential of the agreement. And as well as the formal power structures, some unofficial power structures, notably the patriarchal system, has been left largely untouched. Whilst there have been important changes in terms of women's participation in Northern Ireland, and in particular some very high level success for certain political leaders, female leaders, there hasn't been a systematic commitment to ensuring women's participation in public life in Northern Ireland. There hasn't been a commitment to support the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And so 25 years on from the agreement, we are still lacking the realization of some of the transformative potential that we saw in 1998. But at that point, I'll hand over to Fionnuala to take us on a more optimistic note, I hope.
Maybe marginally optimistic, you know. So maybe just to say that one of the things that underpins the research that Rory, Lena, and I have been doing has been a major set of interviews, snowball interviews with civil society actors, so that we've been trying to really map what they have been thinking over the past 20 years, and also really trying to document the views of actors whose views have not been well represented in the literature, particularly trade unionists and other socioeconomic actors who generally aren't the go-to people in the discussions about whether the agreement is working or not, or at least not in the scholarly literature. And I think if you read the paper, you'll see we have long extracts and quotes from a number of those actors about how they feel about the process and how it's working for them. I think in terms of the landscape that Rory has painted, one of the reasons why we think that landscape is so important is because Northern Ireland is often used as a bellwether of a successful transition. So lots of places think Northern Ireland is the place you go to understand how to do a transition well. And I think the core point that comes out of our research and our work with civil society actors is actually, even in the best case scenario, which in many ways Northern Ireland is, there are also enormous pitfalls and a really long and sustained peacemaking effort that's required even 20 years after a peace agreement is concluded. There's an enormous amount of work to be done, an enormous amount of backsliding that constantly requires tending and re-engagement and work. And key to that, I think we've learned a couple of things about socioeconomic rights work in our research. One is something we talk about less in this paper, but is in another article forthcoming with the Gonzaga International Law Review, which is about what do we know about the inclusion of socioeconomic rights in peace agreements themselves, and the ways in which those are structurally marginalized and structurally underreported. So even when they're in the peace agreement, we don't always actually count that they're there. The language we use to describe them is inadequate. And the second thing we take from our interviews, and that's found in our conclusion of this article, is that when you speak to civil society actors, actually the focus of those actors was on socioeconomic change, and that for them, the bellwether of whether a peace process has worked is socioeconomic rights. And in practice, what's interesting is many, as we know, transitional justice scholars tend to focus on civil and political rights. And much of the documentation that's done during conflict, whether it's Israel-Palestine or Northern Ireland or wherever, tends to focus on egregious breaches of political and civil rights. And those are all true, but actually individuals and community assessments of whether the peace agreement is working for them in the long term tends to be connected to these kind of systemic socioeconomic improvement and inclusion factors. And hope for us is really around what we've learned about civil society work in the post-agreement phase. And I think I'll say a couple of things quickly about that. One is that Northern Ireland had an enormously dense and enormously vibrant an enormously interconnected civil society. And as we know, as some work from other colleagues in Northern Ireland has demonstrated over the years, in many post-conflict societies, the thing that tends to actually weaken almost immediately after a peace agreement is signed is civil society. It tends to get siphoned off, it tends to get under-resourced. And one of the unusual things about Northern Ireland is that the civil society infrastructure has sustained and possibly in many ways deepened over the 20 years of post-conflict life. And the second thing I think that's really unusual and that our interviews speak to is the ways in which that civil society is enormously networked and interconnected and works together cooperatively in ways to leverage their capacity to implement the promised change of the agreement and enforce others. And there's a couple of key examples given in our paper, which includes the work of a small NGO called the Committee on the Administration of Justice, which Rory and I should drop a footnote on. We've been on their board for, I don't know, as long as we've been in Northern Ireland, so that's a long time. But this is a very critical NGO in terms of its litigation, and we give some examples of that in the paper. The other is that we've seen a real emergence of a feminist articulation of what a peace process looks like in Northern Ireland, including the plans for a feminist recovery and rights-based return to power. So feminists themselves imagining what the landscape would look like. It's this collective organizing, this collective sort of engagement, this collective locking together of civil society actors from across a really long spectrum that really demonstrates how change can continue to be pressed in a very complex post-conflict environment. And I'll just close by saying that the paper also acknowledges, while we place enormous stock by what civil society is doing, we also deeply acknowledge the profound challenges they're playing, whether that's structural or economic, or enormous backlash to civil society, which has in some parts of our society actually grown during the course of the post-conflict period. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful start for this session. We'll gather questions and comments at the end of the three presentations. So let me present our next speaker, Advocate Tamar Lustel, who has also been a key figure in organizing this conference today. Tamar is a PhD candidate at the Tzvi Meitar Center for Advanced Legal Studies, Tel Aviv. She earned her LLM from Columbia University in New York, where she was awarded a Human Rights Fellowship of Columbia Law School and the James Kent Scholar Honor. As a lawyer, Tamar served as the head of the legal clinics focusing on social and economic rights in Israeli Academia Institute, and consulted international non-governmental organizations on these topics. She currently coordinates an interdisciplinary research group on COVID-19, a response in human rights, working alongside legal scholars and public health experts. Tamar will present before us her paper titled "The Sidelined Atrocities of the Everyday, Promoting Truth and Reparations for Mass Deprivation of Basic Needs in Armed Conflict." Tamar.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for being here. I'm absolutely grateful to be part of this panel. Thank you for the audience for joining us, and to the many organizers, and especially to my fellow panelists. You are certainly a cutback to follow. Within the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about a phenomena I call deprivation atrocities, the systematic denial of basic needs from civilian population in situation of armed conflict, which to me is perhaps the most dominant form of violence exercised towards civilian during armed conflict, and at the same time, an issue that has been sidelined and neglected by international institutions, both legal and non-legal. And within the next couple of minutes, I'm going to focus on the role of transitional justice field and transitional justice institution within this neglect. What I'll try to argue is that deprivation atrocities form a unique category of violence, and a specific kind of violence, one that requires us to re-challenge some of our assumptions on the construction of violence itself. Specifically, we see that the field of transitional justice within recent years is increasingly calling to engage with social economic rights, with human deprivation. But upon closer look, these material abuses remain marginalized and underexplored by different transitional bodies, with victims and survivors of deprivation often left unaccounted for and unrecognized, and outside the scope of reparation and remedies. Rather than making a normative claim here and saying what your transitional institution should or should not do, I'll try to raise it to a more critical discussion by asking what is this treatment of deprivation atrocities within the field of transitional justice tells us about the field, about some of its underlying assumptions and its underlying tensions. And what I'm going to speak about is roughly divided into three parts. I'm going to start by trying to better understand deprivation atrocities, its unique feature, and why this type of violation is so difficult to be neatly documented and grasped by international institutions, legal and non-legal. And then I'll focus on transitional justice institution. This by no means will be an exhaustive review, but rather selected examples that will try to offer some initial insights into some of the patterns unfolding in the field. And then we'll try to think, what does this tell us about the field? So to start with deprivation, in Yemen's horrific armed conflict, there have been reports of about 19,000 casualties due to direct attacks within the conflict. But at the same time, credible estimates speak of an astronomical number of over 130,000 casualties brought by the lack of access to food, water, medical care, and critical infrastructure. And the same pattern seems to be unfolding in numerous other armed conflicts, from Syria to Gaza in the context of the occupied Palestinian territories, with the Ukraine being perhaps the most recent example. And it seems that there is a stark difference between the lived experience of individuals and communities in areas of active conflict to the limited and fragmented legal analysis of these experiences of deprivation. And I think that this difference has a couple of reasons. First of all, deprivation are carried through diverse, interconnected, and often less visible practices. From direct attacks on medical facilities, sources of livelihood, markets, through sieges, blockades, impediments on humanitarian aid, but also, and far less visibly, different practices, including even domestic legislation that undermines local capacities, food production, health services, even the ability to exit a territory to access life-saving medical care and other basic needs. And deprivation yields a long-term effect that goes well beyond the initial strike or the initial practice and continues evolving over time and over space. And while the violation is a result of a political choice of the direct agencies of the parties involved in the conflict, it also very intimately connected to society's pre-existing structural aspect. Yemen, for example, was a low-income country with highly weakened health systems and social services even prior to conflict, and was highly dependent on imported goods that made it very susceptible to experience famine even after a few days of a blockade. So there is a difficulty to clearly identify what is the act of violation and how it can be distinct from pre-existing factors. Even more so, it's difficult to identify perpetrators in the complex ecosystems of perpetrators, abider, and bystanders, and to identify the affected individuals and communities because of the sheer number of individual families, communities who are affected by deprivation. It's also important to say that deprivation has a highly unequal effect. It disproportionately impacts society's most marginalized groups. Famine researchers have been able to demonstrate how deprivation is a long-term process through which people deplete their essence in exchange to access to their most basic needs. And so society poorest would be the first to suffer. And women have also experienced disproportionately the burden of deprivation, both because of traditionally assumed roles of caring for a family, but also because of limited access to land and to sources of livelihood. It's also a deeply communal harm. And so because of these unique features, I propose to view this, the denial of access to basic needs, as a holistic phenomena and as something that requires us to view as a distinct type of violation. Now, within the legal realms, we seem to have a very robust infrastructure to address deprivation as it could be constructed as a violation of human rights, of humanitarian norms, to amount to an international crime. But at the same time, when we look into the legal realm, we see that legal institutions have dedicated very little attention to deprivation atrocities. And criminal tribunal, for instance, have yet to bring forth a conviction or indictment solely focused on deprivation atrocities. Instead, they view this topic as secondary, as related to property harm, but not as something that stood at the center of attention. Even more so, deprivation was fragmented between different rights, obligation, and legal framework, with the communal aspect of it left completely aside. Precisely because of that, when I approached this research, I thought to myself, this is where transitional justice is going to shine. This is where this field that could be incredibly innovative, creative, drawing from local narratives and need, could devise processes, institutions, and initiatives could really better accommodate deprivation. But once I started going deeper, what I've learned was that transitional justice acted quite similarly to the legal realm, leaving deprivation atrocities unaddressed and unrecognized in complex way. And I'm going to focus on two sets of transitional measures, on Truth and Reconciliation Commission and reparation, to demonstrate some of the ways in which deprivation remained unrecognized. And so Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, could be uniquely positioned to address deprivation, to map the complex nature of this violation. Interestingly, among victims and survivors, what ethnographer found is that famine and likely other forms of deprivation were experienced as a personal, often shameful misfortune, trauma. Truth and Reconciliation Commission could have a vital role in reframing deprivation as a political event. But instead, what we've seen that is a very, very, very limited engagement with deprivation atrocities. And out of the many Truth Commission, only a very small number have even addressed the topic. And those who addressed it, the recognition of this violation remained limited in different ways. First of all, some Truth and Reconciliation Commission maintained deprivation do not amount to a gross violation of human rights. Instead, it's a background fact, root causes, and consequences of the violence. That was the approach, for example, of the Liberia Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whose mandate was dedicated solely to gross human rights violations, which were civil and political rights. In Peru, and also in Liberia, the Commission tried to address deprivation as part of the social economic causes of the conflict and some of its implication, but not as an independent violation that requires the Commission attention and scrutiny in and of itself. Second, some Truth Commission narrowly framed deprivation as a property-related harm. And by doing so, they removed and detached it from other social economic rights violations, such as famine, and from the lived experiences of victim and survivor. And so the Truth Commission in Sierra Leone and Liberia were able to establish widespread forced displacement, but both of them refrained from an in-depth exploration of the way it was deeply connected with other forms of deprivations. And instead, they continued emphasizing it as a property kind of violation. There was also an implicit notion that victims and communities affected by mass deprivation were somehow second-class victims, or ones whose needs are far less present compared to victims of direct physical violation. And here we have East Timor Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation that made a huge step forward by recognizing both famine and displacement, first as connected, and second as an independent human rights violation that in turn create additional violation. But at the same time, the Commission explicitly excluded victims and survivors of deprivation, of famine, for example, from the scope of reparation because of their large numbers and because of funding limitation. And for me, it's quite difficult to understand, while recognizing the importance of differentiating and between different groups of victims and survivors, difficult to understand why victims and survivors of deprivation are devoid of any form of reparation, even a more symbolic one. And that brings us to a second element, to reparation programs. And quite similarly to Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this could be a vital, important mechanism to recognize the suffering of those affected by deprivation. But reparation programs have very rarely included remedies for victims and survivors of mass deprivation. In most cases, they were excluded either implicitly or explicitly. Some commissions were willing to recommend reparation for only certain kinds of deprivation, particularly forced displacement. But by doing so, they created distinction and hierarchies among the victims and survivors themselves. In Guatemala, for example, where victims of deprivation were part of the reparation program, those who suffered starvation were excluded, even if they starved while being displaced. And so you have a creation of a series of distinction and hierarchies among victims. Other pattern was to award some sort of collective reparation that could address some of the harm brought forth by deprivation, but doing so without any form of recognition. And so we have, and so if all of that sounds familiar, it's because it is. What does this tell us about the field of transitional justice? First of all, that it replicates a lot of the tendencies that we can identify within the legal sphere. Just like within legal institution, transitional institution treated deprivation in a fragmented way. Rather than the holistic, all-encompassing horror experienced by its victims and survivors, it was fragmented between displacement and famine. Each of them attributed their different position and importance. The harm was individualized, and the damages brought forth on the community as a whole were completely left aside. And here it's important to note that deprivation had a very profound effect on communities as such, because in the face of acute deprivation, the impossible choices peoples and families have to make really tear interpersonal or familial relationship apart and leaves behind them a shattered social and communal landscape. But that aspect was quite like within legal institution left aside. Also, transitional institution repeated the emphasis on property harm, which is problematic not only because it excludes a major part of the experiences and of the human rights violation of victims and survivors, but also because of it privileged those that already have access to property. So first, what does this tell us about the field? It's a demonstration of the legalistic lens or the legalistic over-domination within the field of transitional justice and some of its inadequacies in addressing these complex types of violation. But even more so, it tells us something about the way transitional justice understands and frames violence. It frames violence in like a binary dichotomy between direct violence, bomb people, to structural violence, marginalization, inequality. But here you have something that combines both of them and that is positioned somewhere in between. It both stems from political agencies, but at the same time, it's linked to pre-existing factor. So it requires us to understand violence in a different way, not as a binary dichotomy, but rather as a spectrum. And even more so, it unveils the way transitional justice exclude slow violence. And by slow violence, this is a term in the context of environmental harms. We refer to unseen, mundane practices that bring forth delayed destruction. And this is very similar to the long-term processes of deprivation that really requires us, much like Yukiko noted earlier, to bring into our attention a temporal lens in order to scandalize, to problematize the limited constructs of victims and harms within transitional justice, just as much as we need to do so within legal ones. So I'll stop here, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tamar. Really fascinating and eye-opening and a lot of food for thought, and we'll discuss everything in that discussion. But first, we have a last speaker in this session before we open up to the Q&A. Our final speaker today is Line Jacobson from the Department of Social Sciences and Business at Roskill University. She researches international standardization of transitional justice through the lens of the ongoing Colombian transitional process towards peace. Her doctorate work centered on the politics of natural resources, practices of corporate securities, and she will talk to us about the materiality of war economics, corporate accountability, and businesses for peace. Thank you. 15 minutes.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining me, for joining us here. As the first speaker who has planned to do a PowerPoint, I will now experiment with sharing my screen, and hopefully there will be no problems with that. So I will just use this. So I hope that you see my presentation now. Is that true? Perfect. So the research presented in this paper is work in progress. And the paper is part of a broader research on the standardization of transitional justice. And part of that is really to get a better understanding of the power of transitional justice, of the standard that has come about, which includes studying the consolidation of the standard as well as the potentials for innovating this toolkit of transitional justice. And what I will present here are some initial reflections on the limits and also some of perhaps the possibilities for corporate accountability. And the research so far is primarily based on literature reviews, but it also builds on my earlier long-time fieldwork in Colombia on the corporate extractive sector. And I have retitled this presentation a little bit. So it's now the materiality of corporate accountability and standardized transitional justice. Transitional justice has been criticized for its legalistic and narrow focus on primarily states and state-like actors, as well as victims of crimes. And the development of one-size-fits-all logic is a movement that has gone hand in hand with an increasing legalization, normalization, and also mainstreaming of transitional justice as a field of practice. And as transitional justice has expanded over time and space, it has also evolved as a global consensus with its four pillars of criminal justice, truth, reparation, and institutional reform. And of course, I know that it also contains more, but these are the paradigmatic and strongest dimensions of this toolkit. The standardization of transitional justice is puzzling because it actually consolidates practices that have so far not really demonstrated a genuine beneficial effect on transitional societies. And one limit to this standardized model of transitional justice, so goes the argument, at least in this paper, is that this historical lack of a material dimension, which includes economic factors and actors in the center of transitional justice. While war economies and economic non-state actors have been acknowledged as involved directly or indirectly in war crimes, and there is an increased awareness of corporations' role in violations of human rights and also environmental harms, so far, there are considerable limitations in corporate accountability related to armed conflicts and past atrocities in practice. And despite of the fact that the business sector is increasingly being presented as a possible builder of peace, I say that transitional justice seems to stay somehow reluctant to include this economic dimension in any systematic fashion. Not only are economic actors not treated as subjects with the legal rights and duties in the same way as the state or rebel groups, but that networks of power and influence over territories of war and peace are also very little regulated. So on that basis, scholars have increasingly been calling for the need to include economic actors in the transitional justice design, as that allows for not only addressing some perhaps of the root causes of conflict, but also begins to unravel some of the colonial legacies of the transitional justice design. In the last few years, remarkable new research on how to hold economic actors accountable has emerged to an extent that could be described as a new, perhaps corporate turn in transitional justice as an academic field. And these are just some of the recent publications that I really recommend. So my research used the example of Colombia as a case of a recent and ongoing transitional justice process. Colombia has really engaged closely with the field of transitional justice. And I would say that the current setup, combined with earlier TJ mechanisms in the country, is really considered both to be innovative and also quite comprehensive. I would say that the Colombian integrated transitional justice systems looks quite a lot like a full-blown transitional justice standard with truth, justice, reparations, and reform, and even more than that, actually. So if a real corporate turn in transitional justice were really to happen anywhere, it could very well be in Colombia. And it is known that especially paramilitaries have been financed by corporations during the armed conflict. But there are, of course, also plenty of other cases of possible corporate complicity in human rights violations and war crimes. While corporate accountability is far from being achieved in Colombia, the TJ design originally in the country was actually to cover third parties as mandatory subjects of its peace tribunal. But this was then, however, later cancelled. But I would say corporations already play an important role in Colombia's transitional situation. And Colombia is actually currently the country in the world with most economic actors being mentioned in legal cases. And that's research done by Lee Payne and her colleagues who have built up this like huge database of corporate mentionings in legal cases. And a few legal cases have actually been carried out with complicit third parties or terceros civiles in Colombia, and more are pending. And some countries have been considering then whether to have their case tried in the ordinary justice system or in this peace system. And I also think, and I also see that's based on my previous research, that many corporations really see themselves forced to engage in this peace industry and pay reparations and compensations, not least to manage their reputational risk. The increased focus on economic violence and economic justice belongs to what Dustin Sharp in 2013 called the fourth generation of transitional justice, and are areas which have really been pushed to the peripheries in traditional approaches to transitional justice, as I guess we all more or less agree in this panel, at least to some extent. But Sharp then claimed that there were an increasing momentum actually to interrogate the peripheries of the field, and also a confidence to call into question some of these of its own legal, of its own blind spots and also the biases. Later, Jeffrey Atterbury took this further and argued that transitional justice is well positioned to advance the development of legal mechanisms for corporate accountability into its fundamental framework. And this echoes, like the critique that comes from this camp echoes the contemporary waves of critique against transitional justice for not being able to incorporate a focus on economic rights, as has already also been said. But innovative transitional justice mechanisms have actually started to address some corporate accountability for human rights abuses and crimes under international law, and there are some sporadic victories for victims of business-related human rights abuses. Interestingly, Payne, Pereira, and Bernal Bermudez, who wrote this nice book in 2020, use the Archimedes lever analogy to point to what they call the contemporary tool of corporate accountability, being a creative combination of ordinary domestic law with international human rights norms. And while there might be a momentum to call into question corporate complicity in violent conflicts, it's important to make clear that the complicity of economic and corporate actors is still seldomly being taken into account in the design of truth commissions or tribunals for transition that deal with mass crimes committed during armed conflict. So one could ask, what might explain this accountability gap? I would say there are several complex legal, political, practical obstacles to corporate accountability. Besides the more technical judicial explanation of the immediate lack of one appropriate entity that has this ability and mandate to exercise criminal jurisdiction over private legal persons, such as corporations, and only natural persons, meaning individuals, there are several other and much more nuanced or socioeconomic and historical explanations. I say that two prominent and interrelated explanations are summarized in what is referred to as the corporate veto and colonial debris. The first indicates the company's abilities through their ample resources that are often at their disposal to veto forms of accountability efforts and protect themselves from prosecution. And this also includes the fear of antagonizing business communities that would scare off potential foreign investments, which have made states somehow reluctant to inquiring into the corporation's role in past violence. And then the argument revolving around colonial debris, which is a term I borrow from an article co-written by one of the panelists here today also, is that colonial harms are not only something that are located in the past, but also to continue to manifest themselves today. And the peace process's lack of acknowledgement of this colonial legacy, which is something that it is itself immersed in, I argue, a fundamental reason for the lack of corporate liability, just as it relates to local networks of power and inequalities of the past that are continued into the present. These colonial or even perhaps new colonial legacies within the international governance regime, and therefore also transitional justice, play a significant role as barriers for corporate accountability. And I really think that Colombia reflects a case in which historical entanglements of networks of power have protected economic actors such as landowners and enterprises. Also, the historical exclusion of indigenous peoples, not least in areas of resource extraction, have seldom, and their vision of development has really seldomly been taken into account. The so-called neo-colonial tendencies have not only protected economic actors and arguably made them operate in a context of relative impunity, it has also excluded their environmental harms and also ways of relating to the environment being beyond being only investable. But because I don't have so much time, I will leave this out for now. And instead go further with some of the ways to deal with these issues. As mentioned earlier, combining hard law from domestic sphere with the soft law voluntary norms of international rights is what has so far led to complicit actors having been held accountable for past wrongs. While being rather, I would say, ad hoc and not systematic or formalized, it might be the best option available, at least for now. But each of these would not be alone enough if they were to stand alone. Furthermore, a general agreement among scholars is that the justice from below, meaning claims done by victims or communities, is actually much more effective than any form of top-down international TJ model, at least in the countries of the global south, or the more soft human rights and business strategies of the global north. And I think that this finding should really be taken seriously by TJ scholars, as it really sheds light on the weaknesses of this Western-centric idea about justice as a one-size-fits-all logic. And I also read it as a critique of this standardized way that transitional justice has come to be practiced and presented. Then just one note on some of the efforts from corporations to deal with this. That could be corporate compensations to impacted communities, and also what is termed business for peace, or corporations investing in peace initiatives. I think while it has become more prevalent to see corporate investments into these things, I mostly see these mechanisms as corporate branding and having very little to do with actual redress and accountability. But of course, it's something that should be discussed. Then where would corporate accountability bring the transitional justice? And this is my final part. Finding and using mechanisms that will lead to effectively holding accountable economic actors, I think might represent a new possibility to make up for the fields legalization, depoliticization, and technocratization, which arguably are all components of what we call in the research project that I'm part of, the transitional justice standardization. And it will allow for new disruptive promises that may threaten the powerful and the status quo. Some reflections just to finalize on possible ways to move forward. I think a move towards a material turn will be needed. And I think that we can build on ideas from transformative justice in order to come up with better and new mechanisms of justice and reparation and guarantees to tackle this overlooked dimension. And then as a way to try and decolonize this, there's plenty of resources available. And there is one more or less, I don't know how established it actually is, but this third world approach to international law was this quite interesting journal. They also come up with interesting ideas to how to rethink international law. And the basic critique is really that international law is not applicable everywhere. And it is a critique against how international law has ignored its own part in histories of colonization, plunder, and enslavement. So it's quite interesting as one form of rethinking this. Then granting legal personhood and rights to nature might be also one way of working with this, as at least it provides an access to the courtrooms for these forms of environmental harms that are not always, but sometimes conducted by corporations. But it's also criticized for various reasons. Among these, its continued reproduction of colonial state-centric perceptions of justice from international law. It might also be a way forward to label ecocide as a crime, as it is being discussed at the moment. Some are also discussing whether universal jurisdiction might be a path forward in studying this. But in sum, I think that studying the possibilities for a material turn and not least a corporate turn that includes this perspective of war economies and corporate complicity and then some of the colonial legacies in transitional justice help to shed light on the power of the international standard of transitional justice. So these were my final remarks, and I'm very happy also to discuss further with you, more established transitional justice scholars, whether there is a transitional justice standard or not. So thank you very much for listening, and yeah, I look forward to the debate.
Thank you, wonderful. So thank you all for profound and illuminating presentations that bring together various issues that some have commonalities, some might be in conflict. We'll discuss this in the next 15 minutes that we have. Issues that all relating to social and economic, environmental aspects and actors of wars and peace processes that have been marginalized generally in the literature on transitional justice, and that the focus on the material helps to shed out and discuss. I have a few questions of my own, but I also want to invite all panelists and other participants of the conference to send me just a note. If you want to ask a question, we can open up your mic and enable you to ask these questions. And then after gathering a few issues, we'll open for the panel to respond. So So I'll begin with the first presentation, which I found as extremely interesting. And the question that I wanted to ask you is, you talk about structural change, reforms, but from the 5 points that you mentioned for the low position of socioeconomic rights, they're very much related to a rights discourse, which, if I quote Kennedy, has its own limitations. So we know that even if we provide greater weight to social and economic rights, and there are enforcement mechanisms that are substantial, not only procedural for social and economic rights, and there will be other ways to address these rights. The main issue is that a rights discourse cannot change power structures. And even enforcement mechanisms for these rights have no transformative power in the elaborated meaning of the word transformation. As long as reform is not targeted to structural change, and obviously what you term as fundamental change in the framework that you use to address change, then even the recognition of social and economic right will not lead to such transformation. So here I had several questions that follow this remark. The first is, what was the aim of the drafters of the documents that you presented? Was it the provision of rights and addressing poverty on a very minimal level that can be achieved by social and economic rights and rights discourse? Or was it transformative in a more rich conception of the term? This was not quite clear from the paper, because on the one hand, you talk about the provision of rights, perhaps on a minimal basis, but at the same time, you use a framework that talks about structural change and fundamental changes. And so the two don't necessarily work together, as I'm sure you well know. And if the aim is substantial transformation, even in your paper, and not necessarily of the drafters, then it might be that new tools should be thought of and developed to increase structural and institutional changes. There's ongoing debates within the field of socio and economic rights scholars on models that take the rights discourse a step further by offering arrangements for social and institutional reforms. Such as, for example, coming from from rights of persons with disability, the example of accommodation. Accommodation is aimed to change the society in which we work, and more structural and institutional basis. Affirmative action is another tool for institutional and structural change. So I'm wondering what was the intention of the drafters, and where do you as authors want to take this, whether to the provision of rights or to a more elaborated transformation? And this actually brings me to Tamar's paper, and I understand, Tamar, the importance that you put on the deprivation of basic human needs, but you differentiate them from other social and economic rights, arguing, and I would love to hear more on the basis of this argument, on the reasons for this argument, that they should be separated in a way. And I was wondering whether you took into consideration not only the justification for separating the deprivation of basic human rights from all social and economic rights, but also the price of what that means for separating these basic human needs from those other social and economic aspects that clearly from the first paper need to be addressed as well. For example, participation in the workforce, unemployment, inequality in pay, et cetera, which we experience in the market, especially after wars. So this is the first question to you, because the separation might lead, I think, to disregard other rights that are fundamental and important. And the other question that I had for you is whether you believe that the concerns that you raised are an issue to war law or to transitional justice, because it might be that the type of deprivation of basic human needs that are occurring during war, if they were addressed properly during war, would not be an issue of transitional justice. So is it an issue of transitional justice or of war law? And this brings me to Line's paper, which I found extremely interesting as well. It might be, if we go back to structural change and to a more transformative aspect, that indeed one of the most effective ways to lead such change is through corporate accountability and responsibility. But here I want to learn more about the potential that using civil law and targeting corporations have for such change, because you also use the term of transformative change. So ideally, we can think that remedies that are very strong remedies, very high payment of pay in these processes and other sorts of remedies can lead to a shift of economic power from one side to another, or to address issues regarding inequalities, in a sense that it's much more elaborated in considering to the preservance of rights. But from your study, what do you know about such remedies and these potentials? So Liora also wanted to ask a question, and I invite others as well.
Thank you for all of you. I have a question for the first paper and for the second paper. With the first paper, as I was reading it, I thought that there was a difference between the different obstacles that you detected, because one of the problem was I think the very core of the peace agreement, which is the power sharing between two groups. So it's not by accident that it brings about a lot of problems for women and so forth. But this was the whole agreement, the whole basis for the agreement, if I understand correctly. So I didn't understand, what do you suggest? Should they have just think of a different way to end the conflict, not by power sharing? Or what is it that you think about this kind of obstacle? And as to Tamar, I wanted to push you further. I think the big elephant in this room is called capitalism. And the idea is that is it enough to just have a new concept of deprivation atrocities, or to talk about the different continuous damages, without asking, it's politics. And the idea is that do you want a more socialist regime that will redistribute the wealth, or is it transitional justice by definition is liberal and is trying to put aside, or always try to put aside, this big inequality, colonialism, imperialism, all of this aside. And this is why we also see its difficulties of treating the corporations. So again, I'm going back to the questions I asked you, Kiko. Is it just a matter of language or concepts, or is it, to put it, how much can we proceed through transitional justice without collapsing the whole idea of transitional justice as a liberal justice?
Thank you, Liora. So we're short on time. I'll give each one 2 minutes to respond. So Rory, do you want to begin?
2 minutes on the problems with rights discourse.
Yeah.
Very good. No, thanks you, both of you, for those questions, which are very helpful and to the point. So on the rights structural change one. I mean, of course, you're absolutely right. I think we do have one line late in the paper in which we briefly acknowledge that, but we haven't teased out the implications of that. I don't think we would trash rights as such. I think we would probably have a pragmatic approach to the value of a rights discourse. And personally, I'm sympathetic to the Patricia Williams view that it's only people who don't need rights who can disparage them entirely. But of course, there's limits to what law and there's limits to what a rights discourse can do. And so we probably do need to, well, we do need to give more attention to what kind of structural changes could be implemented through peace agreements. In terms of the intentions of the drafters, since it's a political compromise involving quite a few different parties, it's difficult to say what the intention of the drafters were in that sense. And in particular, the Northern Ireland Agreement relies a lot on constructive ambiguity in the phrase. So some things are left deliberately unclear in order to actually get agreement, some sort of agreement that moves forward. So I suppose our aim, whatever the aim of the drafters, is one, to see how you can make use of what opportunities the language in the agreement does offer, and two, to understand the pitfalls that await people trying to leverage such an agreement for more transformative purposes. And very briefly on Laurora's question, you're absolutely right, but our analysis and the analysis from our stakeholders is that with the agreement, the power sharing system works, but the rest of it that could have acted as an engine for more progressive change hasn't really worked. And that in effect you have only partial implementation of the agreement rather than complete implementation of the agreement. So we're not saying, forget about power sharing, but we are saying that you need to make sure all of these other elements of the agreement actually work. And it's not just the power sharing with its logic of community vetoes that works.
Thank you, Rory. Tamar, you want to go next?
Oh, sure. First of all, thank you so much for this question. To start with Leora's point, you're absolutely right. And I think that transitional justice must start divorcing itself from the idea of liberal peace. When in my extended paper, I talked about guarantees for non-recurrence, and I included, for example, land reforms, because in my view, we have to start speaking about redistribution, about distributive justice as another component that is really missing out from transitional justice. And it's interesting because this is when I briefly noted to the critique on the human rights discourse, I was mainly speaking of Samuel Moyn, not enough, how minimum core standards really legitimize the vertical inequalities that bring about conflict to begin with. So you are absolutely correct, and I hope to push forward on these issues within a more extended papers. To not questions on humanitarian norms, law of war, this is really interesting. This is something I'm exploring in depth within my PhD. And it's interesting to see how you have a set of seemingly very robust obligations that upon closer look reveal themselves to be what the Kennedys call a confusing mix of rules and counter rules, of laws and exceptions that are wider than the law itself, of prohibition that legitimize other instances of deprivation. And even if humanitarian norms were somehow able to transform and to elevate those, what I think is very inherent challenges and difficulties because of the very way that humanitarian norms was phrased and constructed, there would still be violation. And those violations would need to be addressed towards the end of the conflict, towards the transition within transitional justice mechanism. And that brings us to your first point on whether to treat violation as distinct or as separate. Human rights law pay lip service to the idea of interconnected, indivisible human rights, when in fact we see that far more attention is devoted to civil and political rights over social and economic rights. It's already divided, it's already distinct. And you have a very sporadic treatment. You have sometimes transitional justice institutions looking into education and looking into employment, but really in a way that for me misses out on something that is core and that is maybe one of the few places where we can say it's genuinely universal. Something that can't be really contested, our very basic dignified existence. So for me, it's not a matter of trying to distinguish these set of violation from broader human rights violation. Instead, I am trying to present them as a form of a violation of human rights, but also to emphasize some of their unique features that makes them a lot more difficult to address, but also incredibly, incredibly important to mitigate. So thank you for both of you.
Thank you. In regards to your first, distinction between humanitarian law and transitional justice, it might be that the term of colonial debris used also by Line and others can be very helpful here, I think.
Definitely.
Yes, Line.
So thank you for your question. And yes, it's true that there are perhaps some potentials within seeking remedy through business and human rights and CSR and payments or compensations and all these things through civil action or civil cases. However, so far, according to my own research, but also according to this huge database that Payne and Pereira and Bernal Bermudez have developed, it's not the primary avenue for seeking remedy. It's not considered to be, I would say, and this is my interpretation, systematic in any way. And I do believe that at least dealing with a situation as it is in Colombia, where economic dimensions of the conflict is really like very, very important and part of a broader, structural violence that is one of the foundations of the conflict. I do think it's quite key to center this focus much more on the economic dimension, and at least as far as we can see from the cases that have been through the courts and the different forms of justice systems, those that happen in tort law or civil law it's not efficient enough. It doesn't really have a lot of legacy in terms of dealing with the past in a more systematic fashion. But I'm also not a lawyer, so there's a lot of technicalities in this. So it is a little bit tough to get this like good overview. But even if the payments are higher, I'm not sure that this will really lead to a real genuine shift in power or shift in or any disruption of this corporate impunity. At least it will, I think it needs to be a little bit more systematic. So that's my perhaps a little superficial answer to your brilliant question.
Thank you all for a really intriguing panel. I truly enjoyed it. It was the wonderful continuations of Yukiko's work. We have now a 10-minute break and we'll reconvene at 1:45. So thank you all to all speakers, and we'll continue the discussion in the next panel.
Welcome to session 2, the last session for this day. It's 6:45, so I think we should be starting. So we can start on time and end on time. This session is called The Material and the Stati of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict and Jaffa as a Case Study. We will have 2 speakers. First is Dr. Michal Hess. Am I pronouncing it right? Hoss. From the Department of Architecture at Tel Aviv University, where she's a postdoc and where she researches analysis of public planning and construction struggles in Tel Aviv and Jaffa, and did a doctorate, an ESRC-sponsored doctorate at Cambridge, focusing on the urban resistance and activism of displaced population within transcultural landscapes. And she has set numerous workshops on radical cartography in and around gentrifying spaces and migration detention centers. So this will be Michal. And the second speaker, I'll already introduce both, will be Dr. Yoav Kapshuk from the Kinneret College on the Sea of Galilee. He's a lecturer at the Kinneret College FCC of Galilee, head of the unit of Israel Studies, and he's a former visiting fellow at the LSE Middle East Center and at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. And his research focuses on peace research, peace building, peace education, peacemaking, and transitional justice, especially about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israeli-Palestinian relationship. And he studied at Tel Aviv University and published in many journals. And as you notice from the title, from the description of the researchers, we are shifting now more to the local place from where this conference is being held. And I would say, at least in one of the papers, a very specific locality also of Tel Aviv University, which is very interesting because I know that many of you probably are familiar with how in different conferences, in different places, there's sometimes recognitions of the original owners of the land. You may have come across this in Canada, Australia. It's not something we usually do in Tel Aviv. And I think that if someone tried to do it, it will create a big dispute and will not go quietly. We've just seen how much even the recognition of the Nakba by students in the university has created a huge furor. So imagine if in a conference at Tel Aviv University, we will start the sessions by saying we want to recognize that this used to be a Palestinian village called Chechmunes. What will this create? But today we're actually going to, one of the papers, Michal's paper, will partly address this acknowledgement. So we are going to the local, and Michal's paper is called Hasso Murdered and Also Taken Possession, Mapping Primary Paths Toward Redressing Material Injustices in Tel Aviv Jaffa. So she will speak first, and then Yoav will speak on Transitional Justice from Below During Intractable Conflict, the Streets of Jaffa Commemorating Project. So both touch upon Jaffa, but Michal also not just on Jaffa, but also Tel Aviv, which, and the concept of Tel Aviv Jaffa is also maybe a question to be addressed in the Transitional Justice Conference. The question of the materiality here maybe takes a little bit of different form from the materiality addressed in the previous panel, which addressed topics like social economic rights, etc. I would say that I think we are talking about the time for the material. I think that in a way, for maybe over 20 years ago, we were already asking about the role of social economic rights in transitional justice. And it's also a question, why are we still asking this question? Is it because we're talking about it, but nothing changed? Or is it because we like to go back to this question because it's kind of the Marxist question? I'm not sure, but we can also address this question. So each of the speakers will speak for 15 minutes. Okay, so we'll have time for discussion and we can wrap everything in 1 hour. So Michal, please go ahead. You first.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Please let me know if I'm going over time, as I might slightly over the 15 limits. So I hope everyone can hear me, and I'm going to share my screen now. Can everyone see? Yeah. Okay, great. So today I will be discussing some preliminary research directions, which I hope to develop during my postdoc at the Minerva Center in the upcoming academic year. And the main argument is that violence and injustice in Israel-Palestine extends to construction, planning, and infrastructure. Therefore, there is a need for a spatially informed pre-transitional justice framework appropriate for this locality. And the project objectives are therefore to map existing informal spatial truth projects and document existing knowledge and experiences of NGOs and civic groups in implementing pre-transitional practices, as well as theorizing a potential institutional spatial transitional reform to demonstrate how planning establishments and architects, urban planners can help develop structural mechanisms for justice. Today I'll focus on the first stage, as I'm at the initial stage of research, and I really welcome your feedback as well. Okay, so whilst existing literature in geography, urban studies, and architecture demonstrate the usage of planning and architecture to exacerbate inequality, conflict, and division in Israel-Palestine, the extent to which it can foster accountability, reparation, and reform remains under. So my aim is to address this lacuna and contribute to existing studies, the Center Post-Conflict Acts of Commemoration, This study will investigate the potential of urban planning and spatial practices to eliminate, but also to disrupt prolonged unresolved structural violence and discrimination. So just a brief note about the methodology. For conducting this research, it relies on quantitative and participatory collaborative qualitative methods, which include participating in and participating in their planning sessions, collecting quantitative data, and conducting discursive and visual analysis of court ruling, municipality meetings, media coverage, and architectural plans, as well as co-creating knowledge with architects, urban planner, activists, and lawyers to document their existing knowledge and experience. And today, for this preview into this broader project, I'm going to focus on the empirical context of Tel Aviv-Yafo municipality. And as a map by Decolonizer that we can see on the left details, and we already mentioned this, Tel Aviv resides on the ruins of 6 Palestinian villages, forcefully emptied during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe. And again, we already spoke about it, but this includes Sheikh Munis, a village where Tel Aviv University is currently located. At the aftermath of the war, Tel Aviv observed these villages, and it also annexed Jaffa, whose Arabic name Yafa was altered into a Hebrew version, Yafu, a change which reflects a much broader process and usage of design mechanism and urban planning to erase the Palestinian identity and history, including changing street names, which I think we'll be hearing about today, destroying some of the built environment and rebuilding it, and so on. I won't have time to go into this in detail, but it's important to mention, and it's important to mention the absent property law from 1950, which was really central to the implementation of this process. So the law designates Palestinian refugees who fled during the war absentee, and their property and absentee property, which belongs to the state, and was placed under the management of the custodian of absentee property. And this included Waqf property, Muslim dedication assets, considered the property of the entire Muslim community and placed under the supervision of religious institutions to be used for religious purposes, such as prayer, burial, education, and charity. In line with the law, Jaffa's emptied houses were subcontracted to a semi-private, semi-public Amidar housing company and used to solve the housing needs of Jewish immigrants. And its Waqf property was placed under the management of the custodian. So going back to the present, nowadays, Tel Aviv-Yafo municipality is perhaps not thought of as a site of confrontation, the same way that Jerusalem and Hebron is perhaps. Nevertheless, revealing the contradiction within its projected image as a liberal model of coexistence, in May 2021, it saw an outrage of violence between Jews and Palestinians, which even culminated into mob lynches. And this was happening in other mixed cities within Israel as well during the time. So in fact, whereas the notion of coexistence refers to communities who co-inhabit a space with mutual respect and dignity, Palestinians in Jaffa face the reality of institutionalized marginalization and expulsion from the city. And as global attention was directed towards the struggle of Palestinian residents of Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, Palestinians in Jaffa were similarly protesting a wave of demolitions in the months leading up to May 2021, which was barely registered in the media, and directly links to the injustices of 1948. So after the war, just to explain it briefly as much as I can, after the war, Israel concentrated Palestinians who remained in the city, around 5% of the original Palestinian population, in Ajami neighborhood in the south of Jaffa, surrounded by a fence and patrolled by the Israeli Defense Force. And whilst they were confined and forced to live in houses belonging to other refugees, Palestinian refugees, Israel categorized them present absentee and placed their houses were also seized and subcontracted to Amidar. So the military rule over Ajami is long over. In fact, it ended 2 years after the war. However, many Palestinians to this day still live under Amidar's protected tendency scheme. a scheme which renders house extensions and repairs illegal and forbids tenants from passing these houses to third generations. And we are now at the stage where we're kind of at the third generation to the Nakba. So this is all coming to the surface. So illegal repairs and the considerations of tenants as intelligible property heirs serves as excuses for constant waves of demolitions without compensation. And this issue has worsened since the 2009 land reform that permits Amidar to sell absentee properties in the public market. But this assault over Palestinian space is not only limited to real estate and also extends to heritage. In the summer of 2020, Tel Aviv Jaffa municipality began construction work in Jaffa's ancient Eliasaf Muslim cemetery to replace it with a homeless shelter. In response, for 3 months, the streets filled with waves of protest. Some protests became quite combative and involved throwing stones, blocking roads, and burning infrastructure, whilst others entailed staging aesthetically captivating installation, such as placing a ladder outside the home of the mayor of Tel Aviv, Ron Huldahi, you can see an image of it here, to help him climb from his stubborn refusal to reach settlements over the cemetery. Prayers were routinely held near the cemetery, symbolically reiterating its sacredness through activist bodies. Nevertheless, the homeless shelter officially opened exactly a month ago. So to replace the title mixed city with a concept that gestured towards these types of assaults over Palestinian space and memory, researchers use names such as urban ethnocracy, developed by Iftachiel and Yacobi, or the urban frontier, as Pullum uses. And in this paper, I borrow Karen Thiel's term wounded city to stress the prolonged histories of forced displacement, state-perpetuated violence, and colonialism that shape it, and the term coexistence clearly glosses over, but also to stress the potential for reparation, as per the theme of our conference today. And for the rest of the paper, I will map some preliminary paths that I've detected towards acts of reparation. So firstly, the title for this paper borrows from signs that activists scattered across the streets of Jaffa in 2008, citing the words of Prophet Elijah, as part of a lengthy struggle to save Tasso Cemetery, the only active Muslim cemetery in Tel Aviv-Yafo municipality. The cemetery is a material testament to how ethnic discrimination impacts on daily urban life, including the right for burial, and to the lingering consequences of the Nakba. Yet rather than merely a tragic conclusion of conflict, it has also become a starting point for acts of resistance. So as early as 1957, Haaretz newspaper reported that Jaffa's Muslim community had stopped burying their dead in Tasso to protest the custodian of absentees' properties' mismanagement and negligence of the cemetery, whose gravestones were vandalized, whilst the Jewish agency was permitted to build barracks and a barn for migrants on its ground. Their struggle was successful, and their demands to regain control of the cemetery and evict these structures were met. However, in 1965, the Israeli parliament, Knesset, passed Amendment number 3 to the Absent Property Law, which determined the establishment of state-appointed and supervised committees of trustees in mixed cities to manage the remaining of urban Waqf properties. And as scholars such as Muhammad Yazbek and Ahmed Natour argue, these committees were in fact encouraged by government officials to sell these properties, acting as an Islamic facade to the continual dispossession of Palestinian territory. Indeed, in 1973, the Committee of Trustees of Waqf Properties in Jaffa sold half of Tasso Cemetery land, which was designated for future development of the cemetery, to a Jewish private development company. Upon realization of this deal, which was made in secret and definitely without the approval of the Muslim community, they initiated a struggle to save Tasso that spanned over several decades. It included protests, marches, and communal acts of cleaning and rehabilitation of the neglected cemetery, as you can see in these images from the 90s, as well as filing legal petitions. And in fact, in 1980, the community set up a democratically elected council to act as an opposition to the corrupt state-appointed committee of trustees. And this council became focal in leading the struggle to save Tasso and other Muslim cemeteries across the city, which I won't have time to talk about today. Nevertheless, in 2008, the High Court gave a final verdict which approved the 1973 sale. However, no construction was carried out and the community continued to bury its dead in the disputed territory. Until in 2017, the private Jewish developers sued the board for compensation over the usage of the plot and demanded the immediate eviction of these new graves. In February 2018, the council, which, as I mentioned, was set up as a counter representative of the community to the board, organized 4 buses that drove protesters to the court hearing, where they carried signs such as, "Dear Judge, what about respect for the dead?" And now, recently, in 2021, their battle was won, and Tel Aviv Jaffa municipality approved a plan to regulate the cemetery, including the segment that was sold off, and the court said validated the sale. The plan determines the scope of building rights for religious purposes and related activities, such as an official entrance and route for traffic, which hadn't been set up so far because the cemetery was never actually acknowledged since the formation of the state. And during a meeting of the local planning and construction committee in Tel Aviv, Jaffa, to approve the plan, Muhammad Aderi, a lawyer and the current chair of the Committee of Trustees of Waqf Properties in Jaffa, called it an act of historical and material reparation. As he explains during our interview, an important process that led to this reparation at the institutional level was the merge between the committee, which is state appointed, and the council, which the community itself set up, following a lengthy intercommunal campaign to stress the importance of regaining control over Waqf assets through the existing mechanism, although they're problematic. Shall I continue? Okay. Meanwhile, the state agreed to compensate the owners of the disputed section of the cemetery. And the sudden cooperation of the authorities, which stands against all their kind of previous acts and their attitude, can perhaps be seen as the result of the persistent civic struggle to save Tasso and other Muslim cemeteries that I gave you a glimpse.
Sorry, you should start wrapping up because time is almost over.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So as Muhammad Aderi says himself, all the protests, he kind of agrees with my analysis that all the protests that the community has done have yielded a profit in Tasso. Look how simple people with strong willpower can win over a court and a verdict. So I'm not sure should I move on briefly to the next case study, or should we stop?
Maybe you just mention it briefly, if you could mention it in 2 minutes, but not in detail, and then conclude, okay?
Okay. A graffiti inscription in Arabic and Hebrew, Jaffa not for sale, placed on the walls of the local Amidar offices in April 2021, designates the key locus of current struggles against house eviction and gentrification in Jaffa. A recent campaign under the slogan "From Despair to Hope" seeks to address this problem by pressing the state and municipality to provide a substantial subsidy so that Palestinians under Amidar's protected tenancy scheme can buy their homes. The campaign is led by the Association for Jaffa's Arabs, which was established in 1979, and by Kulna Yafa, which was formed by a Palestinian community leader in the wake of the violent events of May 2021. And ever since, they assemble every Friday in Ajami to call for a just solution to the housing problems in Jaffa. So this campaign is ongoing, and I have a lot of stuff to say about the details of what is occurring during this campaign, but I won't have time to do so.
You can take a few minutes to talk about your next example, okay? But shortly.
Yes. Okay, yeah, and I
think it's especially interesting to talk about it, so take a few more minutes for it, but okay.
Okay, So yeah, so I'm going to end with a site close to home, so to speak, and which deals with a responsibility of Tel Aviv University to commemorate Sheikh Muni's village. And I will just say briefly, I think it's less interesting that there was an attempt to urge the university to acknowledge the site-specific traumatic history in 2003. An NGO has written an official letter that was signed by descendants of the village as well as by academics, but it never materialized. This legacy resurfaced when in 2012, the university built dormitory for students on the remains of the cemetery of Sheikh Muni's village and violated some graves. And it caused some outrage, and some activists kind of came and photographed it and led some political tours to try and mobilize support for a struggle against it. The struggle never kind of didn't take off in the same way that other struggles that I mentioned today did. And the dormitory was built. And now, to mention one kind of brief attempt to acknowledge this, there is a student at the university, a master's student, who is working on building a 3D virtual reality reconstruction of the village. And he hopes to display it at the library of the university as a permanent installation, that people can immerse themselves and see how the village looked. He has not received permission yet, but we are hopeful. We're hoping that the exhibition will open in October. And just to give you a nice quote about his motivation, and I'll end here. So he explains that his aim is to expose students in Tel Aviv University and those coming to visit the area to the local history. However, moving away from the focus on destruction, demolished houses, and abandoned villages, he aspires to commemorate the rich past, such as the booming cultural industry, strength of social relations, the economy, agriculture, ports, trains, but I hope you will. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm sorry I ran over time.
Sir, thank you very much. Normally we do the questions after, but Einat Albin asked, he has to go to a meeting of Board of Governors, not of Tel Aviv University, which will deal with those issues, but Hebrew University because of her ex officio. So she asked for a special permit to ask a question now to Michal, because she unfortunately will have to leave before your presentation. So we'll take one question from her now, and then we'll go to Yoav, and then most of the discussion will be after. So Einat.
Thank you, Eyal, and thanks, Michal, for a wonderful presentation. We look forward to welcoming you here next year. I love the focus on individual activism that, after years of combat and courts, leads to some change. But and I think that these acts of activism are extremely important to look at, and the agency of individuals within processes of transitional justice and introducing the discourse and partaking in the process of peace building among communities. But I want to take a zoom out from these individual examples that you provide and say, isn't this like a very tipa bayam, small actions within a very conflicted zone that eventually are very sporadic, very limited in their ability to make real, transitional justice in the sense that we mean within this notion. And in that sense, I wanted to ask you how you, from the perspective of your investigation, when you come from looking at these acts of civilians or groups, do you see them as more than sporadic actions of activities and of agency, or like, is there a broader picture here than these separated acts of individuals and groups?
It's a great question, and I think I think when I look at these sporadic examples, I feel like I'm giving a lot of, I come to looking at them with a lot of hope, and I ask myself whether that's appropriate, which I think is another kind of, it somehow relates to your question for me in the sense that in some ways, looking at this particular context and locality, I am very, very disencouraged about the potentiality of institutions taking up and kind of actually working towards transitional justice. So I guess my response is that perhaps they don't accumulate to something bigger, but I think for now in this kind of context where something bigger is not going to happen and the institutions are against these initiatives, I think they are important. And I also think that maybe it didn't come across. So for instance, the Amidar housing struggle, next week, activists are going to speak in the Knesset. I think there's a lot of interesting, I like the notion of scale, which is introduced from geography to think about these issues. And I think thinking at different scales, so from the institution to maybe a success at the institution level would be acknowledging Sheikh Munis here. And then we're moving on to the municipal level. And here the municipality and the government are agreeing to regulate a cemetery that they haven't agreed to do so since the formation of the state. And then perhaps from there, we can move on to a broader scale as well. So the Amidar housing initiative would involve financial subsidy from the state. So I think it sort of becomes bigger. It doesn't add up to what you're describing and what I would have ideally liked to see. But I think it is important. I think it's also about kind of, when we talk about colonial conditions, we often focus on the oppressor and how, and in the literature on spatiality, it's very present. And I think even if they don't accumulate to something bigger, they are important to historicize and note, and perhaps we can learn something for them for the future.
Okay, thank you. And we go now to Yoav, and then we'll have time for more discussion questions.
Thank you. I will share my presentation. Okay. Thank you. I start by that in March 2022, signs suddenly began to appear on the balconies of streets in Jaffa. Signs include caption in 3 languages, Arabic, Hebrew, and English. For example, on 3 buildings on the Shiftei Israel street, as you see in the picture, were hung signs with the caption Abd el-Raouf el-Bitar. Abd el-Raouf el-Bitar was mayor of Jaffa during the 30s, and when the city was under the British mandate. He died in 1941, and the southern part of what is now Shiftei Israel street was until 1948 called Abd el-Raouf el-Bitar. Since 1948, after Jaffa conquered by Israeli force, the declaration of the State of Israel and Jaffa's annexation to the city of Tel Aviv, Israeli government changed the Arabic Palestinian street names, first into numbers, then into Hebrew names, such as Abd el-Raouf el-Bitar changed to Shiftei Israel. The idea for the appearance of the names of the historic street in the public sphere is an attempt to present an alternative collective memory to the hegemonic collective memory. This is an initiative of 2 women from Jaffa, Rahel Khadigi and Nawal Arafat, who founded the Street of Jaffa project, Shawar Jaffa bil-Arabi and Rehovot Jaffa ב-Ivrit. The activity of the Street of Jaffa projects is a kind of a local memory activism, operating outside the formal and official government institutions to recover contested past through local on-site commemoration. This activity is a recovery of memories focused on the period pre the 1948 war, event that is being considered as the ground zero of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Activity of present forgotten memory is perceived in this study as an act of transitional justice, TJ, transitional justice from below. Transitional justice is a post-conflict instrument typically carried out by state institutions in society transitioning from conflict to peace, and includes a variety of ways to deal with legacies of past injustices. TJ from below is activity that undertaken by civil society organizations. In the current study, it not only done by civil society, the transitional justice are conducted while intractable conflict is ongoing. Intractable conflict is a very long conflict, and it's contained characters such as delegitimation of the other and glorification of the in-group. The scholarly attention in one of the attentions in the field of transitional justice is the linkage between transitional justice and reconciliation. There's a lot of research about this issue, but there is no agreement how, if and how transitional justice contribute to reconciliation. One approach, or according to one approach, transitional justice promotes reconciliation, as in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. By that, recognition of forgotten past increased the sense of value of the victim group, and thus there is an increase in the reconciled position toward the other. But other research claims that the transitional justice delays reconciliation. In divided societies, knowing of the past is irrelevant to reconciliation because there are conflictual narratives. Even if a forgotten past is being revealed, the information would be interpreted in different ways by the contesting parties. Another approach, transitional justice as decolonization, and that wrote about it. I think he is the I know the word about it. So those three approaches about TJ and reconciliation. So my study is a field research in Jaffa. In Jaffa, between December 21 and June 22, the research is still ongoing as the Shawari Jaffa Street project. Until now, there were interviews with 40 residents of Jaffa and participatory observation of the events that of this project. So my question is if and how an activity of commemorating Palestinian street names promote or reconcile relationships among local Jews and Palestinians. Jaffa, as also Michal mentioned, before the 1948, Jaffa contained more than 100,000 people, 75,000 Arabs and 35,000 Jews. But for an Arab city with a Jewish minority of 30%, Jaffa turned into a mixed city with Palestinian minority of 13%. As I said, the the names were changed to numbers and then to Hebrew names, like from the Bible. For example, the Yefet Street, now the Yefet Street, before 1948, named Tariq al-Hilwe, part of now Yefet, and El Sinin or El Madaris, part of the street. Then in 1948, it changed to street number 4. There's still some that called it street number 4, and then to Yefet Street. Yefet is a son of Noah from the Bible. The project, now I want to show you something that was in a document of the project creator, Rachel Hagigi, and I will read it. Our goal is to create a working community, engage in reconciliation rather than struggle, to reveal a layer of the erased history of Jaffa and allow it to coexist with the hegemonic narrative, not by further erasing, but by exposing another layer, another angle of view, another existence. To present and get rich from the human and cultural diversity that was and still is here, and from all the beauty that it has by placing street sign with the name of the historic street of Jaffa before 1948 next to the existing signs. Okay, so I interview around 40 residents. I'm also a resident in Jaffa, so a part of it was just to get around. And here I want to show some examples from local Palestinians support ignorance and minor opposition, and local Jews support and opposition. So the first example of support from Abed Satel. Abed Satel is chairman of El Rabita, the League for the Jaffa Arabs. So he said that given the fact that the signs were hung after the last May violent events, it should bring about change. I hope for the better following everything that has been here in the direction of a desire for reconciliation on both sides. I expect that there will also be an understanding of the part of the Jewish side regarding these signs, and perhaps this will be the window that will open towards the history of Jaffa, so that there will be more openness regarding the Palestinian Arab narrative and about everything that happened in the area. So this is kind of example of a support for this project and linked to reconciliation or reconciled relations. Another response is ignorance. And this is Abu Shhade, a representative of the Jaffa movement in the Tel Aviv-Yafo City Council. So I asked him how residents of Jaffa react to the science, or how most of the residents. So he said that the street names signs, like Israeli flags, are perceived as a Jewish interior project. The debate whether Israeli flags are positive or not is a debate between Jews, because Jaffa residents do not see the flags, as they do not see the signs. This is for them something they ignore. They learn not to engage in politics at all. There is a parallel life of the Jaffa community and the rest. In practice, the signs as they are today have no meaning in terms of recognition for the local Arab population. And I talked with many local Palestinians. They told me the ignorance, because all they do not want to deal with politics. They're afraid to talk. They're afraid even to put the signs on the balconies. Of course, there's some that's put, but this is a very typical response. And another, in opposition, there's no much opposition of strong, but for example, for Norman Issa told me, what is the point of the signs? To bring back the name of the street, they will not be returned. Hanging a sign is a provocation, as if someone is coming in and pushing you. So what do you expect him to respond? They will not want it. They will want to take it down. Other things need to be done softer, like tours, like a booklet with history of Jaffa, lectures, in such a way it would be more convincing. So those three examples or three direction of approach are represent quite well the responses that I got from all the local Palestinians that I interviewed. About the Jewish Israeli side. So there are the ones that support. For example, a young woman, Aditi Manor Banga, told me the following. I think it is really a beautiful idea because Jaffa is also an Arab city. It can promote dialogue between the parties. I can speak on behalf of my friends and family as Jews. It will not deter, but raise awareness, and that it is also important for the next generation growing up in Jaffa. It is nice to see that first grades from the bilingual school know how to speak Hebrew and Arabic. And one of these elements can be through the street we live on and walk through every day. It can create awareness, dialogue, and closeness. So this is a support that, of course, we can, a lot of from the signs the owners of the people that put the signs on the balconies are think like that, but also others. But there's others that oppose it very much. For example, there's a WhatsApp message that I got from someone that his apartment owner wrote him, and he asked him the following. It was on the week of the Independence Day. He wrote the following: I asked to take down the green flag you hung on the balcony. This week we commemorate the heroes who did not return, and we celebrate Israel's independence. There is no place for this flag on the balcony of my apartment, especially at a sensitive time when the haters of Israel are harming us. I do not want you to get a stone for the balcony windows following the flag. Inside the apartment, you can put what you think. Outside the apartment, I would like to avoid provocation. So this is a typical response from the Jewish part. It can be an opposition, but it can be also something like who care. So all those responses make me think about several things. Eyal, I have like 2 minutes or?
You have like half a minute, but you can take 2 minutes. It's okay.
Okay, I already said that.
No, it's okay. You can take a few minutes. It's fine.
Okay, because if I try to answer the questions, if transitional justice activity like that promote reconciliation and better relations between Jews and Arabs, we can see there's a lot of responses, and it's very diverse, like the research and practice until now from other places, in other countries, in other situations. So for now, I can only say that the Jaffa example is, the complexity in Jaffa example is a complexity as in many other places. It is interesting to think about reconciliation by decolonization, to think, is this kind of activity is part of decolonization? I am going to edit for the research a quantitative study. In the quantitative study, I would like to, one of the things that I would like to examine, the reaction to a situation when the science are placed next the current science, next the current science, because this is the aims, one of the aims of the project initiator, Rachel and Nawal. So to see if this make changes in the responses. There's other things that need to be counted. One is the interactable conflicts. There's events in the that can affect, and the national identity of the project's promoters. So for example, someone told me, if there will be only in Arabic and Arabic promoters, so there could be that the state will react. So it's very important, and the activity is just in the beginning for what I know from the creator. So the continue of the research may be in parallel to the continuum of the initiative. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for those very interesting papers, which both in a way at different initiatives, which are not, again, like part of the state sanction mechanism, like we talked in some other countries in other contexts. So whether we call them transitional justice from below or privatized transitional justice, and I think they join other attempts that we have seen previously, like different, if you remember a few years back, there was like a play which sort of was like try to imitate like a Truth Commission for Israel-Palestine, which was produced already maybe 15 years ago, and so there were quite a few initiatives of this type. And I think the question from Einat that came up before also touches upon whether they can just in the tip of the iceberg, rather than a comprehensive view that, in theory at least, a state process can include. But we do know that state processes are also far from being perfect, and we can, I think have a very long discussion about whether in a way civil society can maybe do things that state on one hand, it cannot be as comprehensive. It doesn't have the means. On the other hand, maybe it can go into places that state-sanctioned measures cannot go or will not go into for different political reasons that can create other limitations. So maybe, you know, we can do an interesting comparison about what can you achieve in each of those tracks. And clearly the limits are very clear of what you can achieve, but also there are limits, as we know from the critical accounts of what happened in South Africa and what we heard about Northern Ireland today and other places. We also know that the state formalized processes also have the limits, which are other limits. So that's just some sort I had, and I have to say in regards to Michal's presentation that I remember that in the past, I mean, it's also the other changes that went within the university's relationship with it, but that greenhouse, which used to be the Sheikh's house, many years ago, used to take guests for lunch, university guests, and I have in my office, I stole once this brochure, which was Zohrot referred to it in the letter they submitted at the time, but I remember, I think it went through a few versions. So I remember the versions that we used to get, and it said that this house was the house of the Sheikh, and then the Sheikh left the house, and then the house stood neglected for many years, and then Tel Aviv University renovated it, and now there's a restaurant there that serves the best of European cuisine. Not regarding it was never the best of European cuisine, but I always found it very interesting entertaining about these gaps in the story. How did the European, you know, why did the Sheikh live? Why did the house stand neglected? How did the European cuisine, you know, reach the Sheikh's house, etc.? So I'm happy to hear that there is now some initiatives that are maybe will bring it to the light, or I really wonder what will be the position of, I don't know, I'm curious to know if you can, whether you know, there was any approach from the university about this. What was the approach of the president or any other positions that was taken about this attempt? So maybe you can address it, but I want, because we have about 15 minutes to see if there are other questions, then maybe you can tell more about this initiative. So questions from the floor. I see Selena has a question, so you can unmute yourself and ask.
Hi. Thank you for both interesting talks and presentations. And I'm kind of taking away parts of my own conclusion for my presentation tomorrow. What I was thinking with regards to both presentations was that transitional justice and reconciliatory efforts in the colonial context, especially when there's symbolic actions taken, a lot of indigenous scholars say that this benefits the oppressor more so than the affected communities, because symbolic action is, at the end of the day, symbolic, and it will not end up in real transformative change if it's not systemic change. So I was wondering, with regards also to the interviews that you conducted and the surveys with the Arab Palestinians, is that also part of your conclusion, or is that something that you're discussing?
Especially in a conference about the material. And okay, any more? I suggest we collect if it's okay. If it's okay, we just see if there are more questions, and then we can, any more questions or comments that anyone want to. Yes, Kinneret.
Thank you both very much. Yoav, I wanted to ask you about the survey you are planning. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about it. What is your plans for it? And Michal, this is very, very interesting. And I think that cemeteries are there are lots of conflict about cemeteries also with the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel. And not just in the context of transitional justice. And maybe if you look at other cases of this conflict with the state, and what does it tell you about the Palestinians' case in Jaffa? Thank you both.
Okay, one more question, anyone? Or if not, we'll go, you can ask, or. Okay, so we have exactly 10 minutes until we have to finish, so that gives enough time for, maybe we'll go now in reverse order. Yoav, you want to answer, and then Michal, you can answer and any of those questions.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Selene, it is very interesting because for example, today I interview residents of Jaffa, Palestinian, And he said that he support the project if the project is something like the first, the beginning of a change. Because as you said, he told me the symbolic aspect like street names is not so important. It's important to put the issue on the table. So it is important, at least in the situation in Israel, Palestine, that's the issue of 1948 is not too much in a discussion, or if it's in a discussion, a negative discussion of second Nakba. Unfortunately, there's recently a politician that are talking about that. So what he said that if it's a beginning and then there will be a discussion about property, a property that was belonged to the Palestinian, that is now belong to the state in the so that's something that it's interesting because this is one of the reasons also that part of the residents of Jaffa are not the Palestinians are not too interesting about that. So because it's I mean most of the residents of Jaffa, if we talk about what Abed Abu Shahade said, are and others are look down and start try to finish the month. How you say in English? To end the month with I don't know exactly but the life are difficult and there's a lot of bad things or negative things that happen because of the state, because of the attitude, because of the all the things that we all know. So I think it's maybe the practical practice like material issues are important. And about Kinneret, I will what I plan is actually there's two directions of a quantitative research. One is to do it in Jaffa. I already wrote some like questionnaire, and it's something that I will probably connect it reconcile. But of course,
Did I only lose the voice?
No,
we are losing you.
I think there's a problem. Can you hear me or not?
Now we can hear you again.
Okay, because the regional connection unstable. So I will say that another direction is to do it in some in a place that I can control on variables. It will be very difficult, but I think about some options. I'll have to talk about it maybe later in the future.
Michal.
So I'll try and address these questions together. Thank you very much for really interesting questions. I think what I'm finding at this early stage of the research is, which I think is interesting, is actually the troubling of these distinctions between the symbolic and the material on the one hand, and between the institutional and the civic on the other. So as I was trying to show through the very kind of complex cases of the cemeteries, it involved the fact that Tasser was recognized, involved the fact that the Muslim community that was not wanting to participate with the state appointed committee decided to go in there and change it from within. It involved a close collaboration with the municipality. It involved speaking to architects who were even kind of subverting their own role as architects, representing the municipality and giving advice to Muhammad Aderi about how to win this recognition again after the court ruled against it. And again, on the one hand, they are appealing to courts, and it's really important for the struggles, and they've had some victories in that front, but other times when they can't do that. So I think it just shows how these connections are, there's all these dynamics that I think are really interesting that we can learn from. And in terms of the symbolic versus the material, so I think, so for instance, the case of the Amidar case, this is about the state giving money to people so they can buy these houses. They lost their houses in 48. Now they want to buy the houses that they were placed in, so that they don't have to face a second forced displacement. But something interesting that activists said to me was that when the struggle over Eliasaf Cemetery was happening, it brought, and Tasso, it brings so much more people to the streets than the struggles over housing. So there is, so what I'm learning from that is that for them, the symbolic seems to be really important. However, to complicate it further, Eliasaf, they lost, but they're saying that the municipality is almost kind of, they manipulated the municipality because the municipality thinks it won and it built the homeless shelter. But they didn't care about that cemetery as much because they were really fighting about their rights to bury their dead, which is not symbolic, it's very material. And they always prioritized that struggle. So it was part of a strategy to win over Tasso, to fight so fiercely over another cemetery. So I think there's a lot of interesting complications of these binaries, which I'm only beginning to unpack. And in Kineret, for your question, I would say that it's really, I definitely want to look into that more because first of all, ultra-Orthodox came to show their support during the struggle, which is really interesting. And also it's interesting to compare Christian churches and cemeteries versus Muslims in Jaffa, Tel Aviv, which were not compensated by the state. So there's a lot to learn from this kind of comparison, I think. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have 3 minutes according to the formal calendar. So if anyone wants to say short comments, they can still do that. Otherwise, I think we had a long afternoon and it's okay to thank the speakers and the organizers and the audience and say that we will reconvene tomorrow at 4 p.m. Israel time for the second day. So thank you all for being here. And I'm not saying the formal thanks because the organizers have said them and will say them. I'm just the chair, but I'm thanking everyone, all the organizers and helpers and everyone. I will thank Tamar and Leora who personally asked me to chair the session. So I'm just thanking them personally because they were the one who solicited me back to this topic, which I've been working on in the past and recent years. I maybe a little bit thought that we're more maybe seeing, transition from democracy rather than transition to democracy. So, but it's always relevant to go back to those questions. So thank you so much and see you tomorrow.